Hello, I'm Professor Sam Broadhead and I'm presenting with Mega Bailey, Project Coordinator, a paper called Make It Happen, Developing Cultural Engagement Through University and Charity Collaboration. So I work at Leeds Arts University in the UK, and this is basically a project that was between ourselves and a charity that's funded by the Arts Council called a National Portfolio Organisation. These kind of organisations are there to encourage and develop participation in the arts through the People and Places Consortium. This particular project had funding from Research England as a form of knowledge exchange between the university and the charity, the NPO. We're working in a context where there historically has been low arts participation, and this project aimed to enhance or develop the opportunities for people in the local area to experience the arts. So what were the issues that this project addressed in particular? There's a feeling that in the UK, the opportunities for people to study and to learn the skills of how to be socially engaged artists are diminishing. Socially engaged art is where people work with communities, with people, to develop audiences for the arts, but also to work on artistic practices together. Sometimes this kind of work is known as community arts practice. So various commentators have noted that the kind of ways to learn those skills are diminishing. So whereas people might be competent practitioners, they might be very good at their art practice, whether that's textiles, ceramics, sculpture, painting, drawing, performance, music. They don't necessarily learn how to be a practitioner that works with other people or other communities. A very important quote for this presentation comes from the CEO of People and Places, and this was said in 2017. In my view, there is nowhere in the UK that teaches socially engaged arts practice, which is bizarre because socially engaged practice is the fastest growing and most significant element of how art practice is changing globally. Yet the UK education system does not seem to be responding to that. So the challenges for socially engaged arts and performance work within this particular context is that it needs to reach low participation areas, the audiences that inhabit those areas. And as a result that people are engaging in the arts, there is actually a lack of local practitioners who perhaps could respond to those communities in a sensitive manner. So there's a danger that people who are practitioners from outside the region come in and work with local communities, and the funding then doesn't become focused. It's not awarded to practitioners in that community. So the solution for this is to try and identify and train the creative practitioners that are from the local area in socially engaged arts practice or community arts practice. So the aims and objectives of the Make It Happen project were to educate and inform participants on how they could design and deliver an interactive, community-focused activity, whether that was workshops in music production, encouraging people to take part in performances on the street, to produce visual arts activities for people within a particular area. Also, to educate the participants of the project, to provide them with an experience of developing a project that they could pitch in response to a particular brief, and perhaps if they were lucky, that brief could be funded. Thirdly, it would be really good if an outcome of the project was to seed and grow a creative network within Yorkshire that is capable of developing high quality engagement projects. So in order to meet these aims, make it happen, aim to create a summer school which took place over 3 days per week over 3 weeks between the 4th of July 2022 and the 20th of July. And this would result in participants creating proposals for an outdoor and interactive art activity that could be seen during an event which was called Dewsbury Heritage Open Day. The theoretical lens for the analysis of this project comes from the work of a sociologist in education, Basil Bernstein, and in particular his work on classification and framing. So classification refers to what, the content, and how that content is managed or organised. The framing is concerned with how that content is delivered, the kind of pedagogies used to teach that content, that curriculum. So he thinks of classification in terms of how categories are insulated from one another. So, for example, how curriculum can be organised where subjects are taught in discrete sessions. And you might get a course on mathematics, you might get a course on history, on philosophy, but they're very discrete topics. However, classification that is very open and what he would say weak is where subjects are taught together or delivered together. So a project-based approach would have elements of perhaps budgeting, research into the history of a place, thinking about the values, but all these will be taught together in a much more fluid and integrated way. Framing is about how that delivery, that content is taught, and it asks who has got control, who controls the pacing of a curriculum, who controls the sequence of events. Is that something that the participants, that the students in effect control, or is that something that teachers control? So this idea of classification in particular can be applied to the structures of organisations. Bernstein clarifies that where we have strong classification, the rule is things must be kept apart, must be discrete. Where we have weak classification, the rule is that things must be brought together and kind of unified. So when we look at the organisation of the NPO, the charity, the small charity, we can see that because it's a small charity and that people, there aren't many people in that organisation, the boundaries between job roles are very fluid. People work in lots of different areas. They share job roles. They may be responsible for more than one task. This is very different in a university where job roles are clearly delineated and regulated, and the boundaries between those job roles are actually likely to be impermeable. Therefore, the classification is strong. So we can see that these two organisations actually have a different mode of organisation, a different mode of management. And the question is does that mean there might be tensions if these two organisations work together? So Bernstein's theory of classification and framing suggests that the stronger the classification and framing is, the more the education relationship tends to be hierarchical and ritualized. Weak classification and framing leads to educational relationships that appear non-hierarchical and fluid. These might be more student-centered, where students appear to have more control. So in our context, the participants of the project might have more control, rather than it being quite teacher-centered. However, it must be said that this is an appearance of the students having control or having freedom. What Bernstein says is that in weakly classified and framed curricula, there may be ambiguities about how people might be assessed or evaluated, for example. And often control is more sophisticated through interpersonal communication. Implicit power is played through by conversations that some members of the group might experience, whereas others might not. So Bernstein's theories talk a lot about the pacing and sequencing of a course. You know, who decides what sequence topics are taught in, how they're taught, are they taught together, are they taught separately? But also the pace, you know, is it fast paced, or are things quite slow? Are people given time to learn and fit in the learning with other constraints on their lives? And this fits in with theories explored by Adaf Jones, developing rhythmic intelligence. And he talks about the idea that we need to think about education not as a fixed curriculum or a timetable that's fixed, but that it's always in motion, it's ongoing and always in flux. And we need to think about all the players in that education relationship and think about their rhythms and patterns and understandings of time. So it may be that the agents in the education relationship might operate on daily cycles, but there also might be other cycles relying, for example, on the seasons or on semesters, or there might be annual cycles. Learners, for example, might have biological or psychological rhythms and understandings of time, as do teachers. Within this project, the biographical rhythms of learners are also important. Do they have patterns where they need to care for children, pick up children from school at a certain time? Do they have certain times where they need to be there for people that they're caring for in their families? Do they have to respond to the times of jobs, part-time jobs that they need to respond to? The question is how education is organised, how it's paced by schedules, timetables, calendars, and social interactions. We can't assume that everybody has the same understanding or experience of time, but who controls that time? Will it be the participants, the organisers, or are they controlled by external factors? So when thinking about the course delivery, this was undertaken by what we call artist teachers, people who had a track record of developing socially engaged practice and could share their experiences and their expertise with a group of novice artist practitioners who might have brilliant creative practices, but not necessarily have had the experience of working, you know, as in community artists themselves. The course was also delivered by 2 university lecturers who did 2 discrete sessions on participatory art and poetry. And the whole process was then observed by a researcher who made a note of those observations through field notes and also taught to the participants to get their response. So the participants who took place, who we wanted to learn about these skills that they might not necessarily have covered in their previous education, we ended up with 10 participants. Four of them had gone on to postgraduate study, and all of them had some form of degree level education in an arts practice. Quite a lot of them were in the 36 to 45 age range. We were quite surprised, but because of the way that we structured the course, it was able to be attractive to older artists and practitioners, because we had it starting at 10 o'clock and finishing at 2:30, which meant they could build the course in around their other commitments in their lives. We did have a majority of people come in from about 30 minutes drive away, although there weren't anybody from the actual community or locale in which the project was designed to take place. And there was a majority of female participants, or people who identified as female. This is the programme that was undertaken. It was based on experiential learning, where people would have a go at researching, actually using that research to develop a brief, and that brief would be heard by the CEO of the National Portfolio Organisation at the end of the programme. And this was guided by, as we said, artist teachers who were experienced in planning and developing projects that had a community arts or socially engaged focus. This was the intended curriculum, the things that we wanted to be covered, you know, quite, I would say, bureaucratic skills or administrative skills like preparing a budget, or thinking about risk management or risk assessment, reporting, evaluation, how we document activity, but also much more complex and deeper learning, thinking about the context in which socially engaged practice happens, thinking about how we work in an ethical way with communities, how we develop respect for the site, for the people who live on that site. So lots of varied kinds of skills and knowledge and understandings we hope to develop from the programme. These were the survey results. Just quickly, we had a survey after the programme to see what extent people felt that the programme was covered. And it was interesting that the deeper skills, like understanding the context, the ethical elements of it, like respecting the site and collaboration, these were thought to have been really well covered in the programme. So we also had verbal feedback, and I think it's worth just looking at this in a little bit of detail. So this is all from different participants at the end of the course, and I'm just going to read some of these out. This has been an absolute game changer for my career. Having the time and space to input from others to consider proposals has made such a difference in motivation, positivity and confidence. Thank you. I thought the course allowed us to touch upon all areas above in a relaxed fashion, with some topics having more dedication than others, meaning that we had a lot of scope for the thinking and the necessities of socially engaged practice, rather than concentrating on a few topics and missing others. I didn't realise the course would be in this depth. We covered an absolutely huge amount in a short time. I have learnt so much in a short space of time about an area I am new to. Wonderful course, although it seemed to slow down a little during the second week. I feel it would have been good to have had the brief earlier on in the project. Overall, a good course. I felt the start was relaxing and perhaps rushed towards the end to get the proposals ready. So what of note of these comments from people is the different understandings of time and different understandings of the pace in which the curriculum was delivered. So to kind of understand this a little bit more, analysis has been undertaken of the temporalities and rhythms of the players in this project. So, for example, when looking at time in relation to the university, the pace was quite slow. The sequence of events that the university wanted to undertake was quite consistent, but with that consistency came an element of inflexibility. The rhythms in which the university felt comfortable in operating in were annual, and they were controlled, the university, from time-bound deadlines from external bodies such as funding organisations or the financial regulations with which the university had to operate. So the university was at the same time controlled and controlling. The National Portfolio Organisation, the charity with which the university worked, was much more rapid, worked at a faster pace, made decisions in a fast way, and as a result, perhaps it was quite inconsistent. It was very flexible and open, and the rhythms could be seen as sporadic and opportunistic. So if something happened, if there was an opportunity, the NPO wanted to change direction, wanted to change the curriculum or the outcomes of the curriculum to respond to the opportunities that it saw that on the horizon. And as a result, the NPO could be quite controlling in response to some of these opportunities that it identified. The artist teachers worked both in a slow manner and in a fast manner, depending at what point the curriculum was undertaken. So at first, when it was felt there was a lot of time, the curriculum was delivered in a very slow and relaxing manner. And as the end became more on the horizon, the artist teachers worked in a more fast manner. So they were inconsistent and flexible. They worked on daily rhythms and weekly rhythms, and were quite controlling of what was going on. The participants had biographical paces. They had to fit their pace and sequence depending on their life commitments, organising their time so they knew they could pick up the children at a certain time, that they could, they need to manage how, what time they got to the project and what time they left, and there was a lot of anxiety around that. So some of their sequencing was very habitual. They needed to know what was happening at what time. And sometimes that habitual understanding of what was going on was interrupted, when opportunities came along, when the artist teachers needed to change things, that kind of rhythm and pattern was interrupted for them. So their rhythms and episodes were, mostly daily, operating on a daily rhythm of what they needed to do, but also sporadic. Sometimes they had to change or replan and refocus, depending on what's demanded from them from the course. And on the whole, I would say the participants were much more controlled, rather than being in control of their own learning. So as a result of this analysis, it can be seen that the rhythms and times of all the agents were entangled and there's a lot of vying for control. And I would say that the organisers and the people who delivered the curriculum had the most control of the sequencing and pacing of the course. And unfortunately, in spite of the programme wanted to be about experiential learning, and being quite open and flexible, the participants themselves actually had least control. They had constraints from many areas, from the organisers, but also from their lives outside the programme. So reflecting on the project as a kind of loose conclusion to this analysis, I think definitely different organisations have different rhythms and temporalities, and that tensions might arise when universities are working at a slower pace, and have different needs and work differently according to their financial regulations, for example, that are very time bound. So NPOs work faster at faster pace, but are also very quick to respond to opportunities. Experiential learning appears to be open. However, things like evaluation might not be as transparent. The pacing and sequencing of content might oscillate. Sometimes the participants might have control or seek control, whereas the artist teachers also ultimately have control of how the curriculum is delivered, at what time things are taught, how fast those things are covered. There was a lot of learning covered in those 3 weeks, and it was a very ambitious curriculum, yet the feedback was that it wasn't very superficial. Actually, a lot of deep learning did take place. What was interesting is that not all key areas of knowledge were identified as being covered. There were 1 or 2 where people, only a couple, but a couple of people felt areas such as the equality and diversity aspects of social engaged practice weren't covered at all. And what was interesting was I think that the boundaries between the participants and the artist teachers were always shifting, and this was always in flux. And perhaps this model of experiential learning does suit a lot of people, but perhaps it doesn't suit everybody's mode of learning. Here are some references that were cited during the presentation. I hope they're of interest, and I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to listen, and I hope that this helps other people think about time, sequences, temporality, rhythms and patterns in this kind of socially engaged practice. Thank you.